When you hear the name King Solomon, what's the first thing that springs to mind?
For most people, it's, wisdom, unbelievable riches, the
Yeah.
temple.
Exactly. He's this sort of global standard for the ideal king. Divine blessing, success, prosperity, all of it rolled into one.
And that's the exact image our sources are here to, let's say, complicate. We've been looking at some deep historical readings of the books of Kings and Samuel, and they paint a very different picture.
A picture that suggests the Solomon we all think we know is really the product of a brilliant and pretty ruthless political narrative.
That's the mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack this for you. And this isn't just about his mistakes later in life, which everyone knows about.
Right. This is a challenge to the entire foundation of his rule. The argument here is that the original story wasn't a celebration at all, but actually an indictment, an account of political failure and oppression.
It's a huge shift in perspective. For centuries, especially in modern Christianity, David and Solomon are held up as these models of faith. But what historians argue is that the ancient writers themselves saw the monarchy, and especially Solomon's reign, as the start of a systemic failure for the nation.
So let's start at the very beginning. His ascent to power.
Yeah.
Because right out of the gate, he had a massive legitimacy problem. I mean, he was a total outsider.
A complete non-contender. You have to remember, Solomon was the son of Bathsheba.
Formerly the wife of Uriah the Hittite.
Exactly. So he was way down the line of succession. His older half-brother Adonijah was the accepted crown prince. He was already acting the part, and crucially, he had the big players on his side.
Like who?
The military establishment. Joab, commander of the armies. The chief priest, Abiathar. He had the popular support. He was the legitimate heir.
So how does the long shot, the non-contender, end up on the throne?
The sources describe it as a meticulously planned joint project, a political coup, really, engineered by two of the most cunning people in David's court.
And those are Nathan, the prophet and political advisor, and Bathsheba herself.
This wasn't divine will playing out. This was a raw political maneuver for survival.
Let's talk about Bathsheba, because she's often seen as this passive figure. But these sources paint her as a master strategist.
Oh, absolutely. A true political force. Her actions seem calculated right from the very beginning. But her real genius shines after Solomon is born. She plays the long game.
How so?
She uses feigned distress, tears, to get a private, sort of half-hearted promise out of an aging, failing King David that Solomon would succeed him.
A promise? He probably didn't even take that seriously.
Probably not. But she had it. She put it on the record.
Okay, so what about Nathan? What was his motivation? Why would the chief prophet back this completely unconventional succession?
Political survival. Plain and simple. Nathan was fighting for his whole power structure. Adonijah's group, they wanted to go back to the old ways.
The strict Mosaic covenant law.
Right. And a shift like that would have pushed David's entire inner circle, Nathan included, out of power. They would have been replaced. For Nathan, it was Solomon or political oblivion.
So that makes the final move, the actual coup, feel so much more tactical.
It was a masterclass in creating and managing panic. Bathsheba goes to the basically incapacitated David, weeping, reminding him of his promise.
And then Nathan just happens to walk in.
Right on cue. He rushes in, pretending he has no idea why she's there, and drops the bombshell. Adonijah is being crowned right now, and by the way, he's planning to execute our entire faction.
It's a psychological blitz.
Yeah.
It's designed to force a panicked decision from a confused old man.
And it works perfectly. David, terrified for his loyalists, immediately orders Solomon to be publicly anointed. And just like that, you have a new regime. A progressive, you could almost say, a military government focused on centralized power, not traditional law.
But because it was a coup, this new regime had no popular support.
Right.
Especially from the northern tribes who wanted Adonijah, so what do?
They launch a massive PR campaign, a kind of political theater to manufacture divine approval.
Which brings us to one of the most famous and maybe most misunderstood stories. The 1,000 offerings at Gibeon.
Yes. Today, people hear 1,000 offerings and they think he prayed 1,000 times or gave 1,000 separate gifts over 1,000 days.
That's the modern interpretation, yeah.
But it's based on a complete misreading of the text and the context. The historical reality is that Solomon went to Gibeon specifically to win over those northern tribes. They valued big public displays of piety.
So he put on a show for them.
A huge show. A state dinner disguised as a religious festival. He sacrificed 1,000 animals as a burnt offering. 1,000 head of cattle and sheep.
Not 1,000 different times, but 1,000 animals all at once.
All at once or over a few days, and after the sacrifice, they had a massive political banquet with the meat. It was a spectacular display of wealth and piety, all designed to buy their loyalty.
That's a critical distinction, because so many modern religious practices are based on this idea of giving 1,000 separate donations to get a Solomon blessing.
It's a complete inversion of what was, at its core, a massive one-time political expenditure.
And right after this huge feast, the narrative continues with the famous dream.
Of course. God appears to Solomon in a dream right after the big spectacle.
And he asks for wisdom.
It's the perfect PR answer, isn't it? He claims he didn't ask for riches or a long life, just wisdom to govern. It makes him sound so humble, so worthy. It justifies the entire power grab.
And God's response, giving him wisdom plus the bonus of wealth and power, is the ultimate divine stamp of approval.
It's propaganda genius. And to really seal the deal, what happens immediately after the dream story?
The judgment of the two mothers and the baby.
The timing is just a little too perfect. It's highly suspicious. This dramatic public case, right on the heels of him supposedly receiving divine wisdom, feels strategically chosen, or maybe even staged.
It was a proof.
It was the proof. The people see this incredible judgment and they think, wow, the Gibeon dream was real. God's wisdom is in him. He manufactured legitimacy.
So once he's locked that down, what's his next move?
Consolidation. He immediately eliminates his rivals, Joab, Shammai, Abithar, and establishes what the sources describe as absolute, centralized, iron-fisted rule.
And this is where we start to see the real cost of all that legendary wealth. We go from political theater to fiscal tyranny.
Solomon knew the old 12-tribe system was too decentralized to pay for his ambition, so he just abolished it.
Just got rid of it.
Gone. He redrew the map, created 12 new administrative districts based on one thing and one thing only: economic productivity.
And the goal was just to fund his court.
That was the entire point. It was to create a guaranteed supply chain for his personal extravagance. Each of those 12 districts, in turn, was forced to supply the royal court for one full month out of the year, and the burden was... It was unbelievable.
Give us some context. What are we talking about daily?
Okay, so every single day, the districts had to provide 90 measures of flour, 30 oxen, 200 sheep, plus all this wild game. But the real killer, the thing that broke the economy, was the military.
The horses.
The feed for thousands of chariot horses. The cost of that alone would have been completely crushing for regular farmers.
It sounds less like taxes and more like systematic exploitation. Just draining the life out of the countryside.
That's exactly how the sources frame it. The language they use implies the people were having the fat and blood squeezed out of them just to keep the capital running.
So when you read those famous lines about silver being as common as stones, or people living peacefully under their fig trees,
that peace and prosperity was only in Jerusalem. It was for Solomon and his inner circle. For everyone else, life was a constant struggle to meet the king's impossible quotas.
And this wasn't even his only income stream.
Not even close. He was also pulling in massive tribute from surrounding nations he controlled, and that money went straight into his personal treasury. No oversight, no accountability.
And on top of all that, there's the personal extravagance. The scale of his household is mind-boggling. 700 wives and 300 concubines.
1,000 women, each one representing a political alliance that had to be maintained and a cost that had to be paid. The financial drain was just constant.
And that's before the building projects. The famous temple took 7.5 years. But his own palace, that took 13 years. Almost double.
And that says everything, doesn't it? About his priorities. The amount of material he needed, the gold, the silver, the copper, was so immense that he actually ran out of money.
And he started selling off national assets.
He had to. He sold off entire towns in the Galilee region to pay his debts. He was literally carving up the country to pay for his own monuments.
Let's pivot to his wisdom, his intellectual side.
Yeah.
We think of him as writing the Proverbs.
And that's another point of confusion. Much like the 1,000 offerings, Solomon didn't invent all these proverbs from scratch. Wisdom literature is, accumulated human experience.
So what was his role?
He was the great editor, the great collector and curator. His genius was in organizing and synthesizing all this existing knowledge, especially about statecraft.
Which brings us to the final point. Why were all these foreign kings and queens traveling to see him? What was the wisdom they were actually after?
They weren't coming for spiritual guidance.
Right.
They were coming for a master class in how to be a successful autocrat. They wanted the instruction manual for totalitarian rule.
So they wanted to know how to manage a court of thousands, how to maintain a huge army, how to squeeze every last drop out of their population without a revolution.
That's the wisdom they were seeking. The blueprint for a successful dictatorship that could fund itself through ruthless efficiency. His wisdom was the wisdom of effective tyranny.
This whole deep dive really turns the traditional story of Solomon on its head. It's a story of political manipulation, economic oppression, all hidden behind this brilliant PR campaign of divine blessing.
And that brings us back to the main point of our sources. The books of Samuel and Kings, they aren't meant to be read as a celebration, they're a confession. An honest record of the failures and the wickedness of the monarchy that led the nation directly into collapse and exile.
We've basically been confusing a warning label for a blueprint,
Perfectly put.
which leaves us with a really provocative question for you to think about. If the original narrative of Solomon's wealth and power is actually an ancient warning against national failure and oppression, what does it mean when we, today, use his life, his methods, and his riches as a model for divine blessing or success? What does that say about how we view power in our own world?